So here's a problem a lot of households would potentially love to have. The childcare bill drops and suddenly there's a few £100 a month spare. What do you do with it? You've basically got a couple of choices and they point in very different directions. Choice 1, throw it at the mortgage, kill the debt years early, own your home outright, sleep easy at night. Choice 2, feed it into your pension, harvest that sweet, sweet tax relief, and then let it compound for the next couple of decades. One of those choices buys you certainty. The other, on paper, could potentially build a lot more wealth. So today, Chris and I are going to get into which one actually wins, some real numbers, and why the spreadsheet answer might not be the answer that you actually go with. Now, Mouthy Money is proud to partner with Coinbase. If you're thinking about getting into crypto, but not sure where to start, consider Coinbase. In just a few taps, you could buy, sell, and hold Bitcoin, Ethereum, and a range of other popular crypto assets, all from right here in the UK. Coinbase is registered with the FCA in the UK, and with world-class security, you can invest with confidence. Whether you're brand new or already building your portfolio, Coinbase gives you simple tools for crypto investing. Join millions already using Coinbase. Download the app today and start your crypto journey. Find out more in the summary. Remember, don't invest unless you're prepared to lose all the money you invest. This is a high-risk investment and you should not expect to be protected if something goes wrong. This is not investment advice and it is not a recommendation to buy or sell any particular digital asset. Chris, hello. Welcome to the Mouthy Money podcast. How are you doing?
Yeah, good. Thanks, Ed. How are you?
Yes, very well, thank you. So this is the question that we're answering today, and it relates specifically, Chris, to your situation, something that you're trying to work out at the moment. And we've been doing some really specific numbers on this. And this ultimately boils down to, well, I've suddenly found myself with a little bit of extra cash to spend every month. I have a mortgage, but I also want to save for retirement. What do I do? And Chris, I'm going to ask you straight up, what do you want to do at this point?
I'm not sure is the honest answer, Ed, which is why we're having this conversation. There's, as you rightly pointed out, our childcare bill is set to reduce in the near future. So there will be about £500 spare a month. And so I am looking at both those options you outlined at the top of the show. One is pay off my mortgage early. At the moment, we're on a 29-year term, and it won't take Columbo to work out that on a 29-year term, I am 43. That will take me to 72. I've been working on the assumption that my retirement age will be 70. And my wife's a bit younger, so that will take her to in and around state pension age, which is about where we're looking to sort of stop working potentially. So I need to pay off my mortgage early if I want to hit that. So I was thinking, well, maybe this is an opportunity for me to do that. But then I'm aware of the compounding impact that it can have if we put that money to work in a pension. So that mortgage will need to be paid off early in some way, shape or form. The question is when, what is the most efficient way to do it? And how can I ensure that I build the most wealth at the time?
So this is where things get really interesting because you and I have gone through the numbers a little bit beforehand to actually really work out, well, what is the answer to this question? And the answer to the question is actually quite surprising, I would say. Now, based on your inputs, which is effectively an extra £500 a month, what do you do with it without getting too much into the kind of sticky details of who contributes what and how much comes out of this, that, the other? Basically, we ran the sums and it looks like in option 1, where instead of contributing more to your pension, you put that £500 a month extra towards overpaying the mortgage based on what you are contributing and what Tanya is contributing, you'd end up with about £750,000 in pensions, which in today's money sounds pretty great. In 28, 29 years time or 27 years time, I think was your horizon, you know, that could be quite different depending on what happens with things like inflation. No, that figure also based on kind of long-term performance of pension stuff is also going to be quite variable. But that's the kind of the baseline calculation we have here. Now, here's the really interesting thing. If you take that £500 and just keep paying your mortgage with the normal amount, but you stuff that into pension instead, with all the tax relief, etc., that you get on top of that, you're looking at a pension pot of over £1.3 million. So that is a difference of the best part of between about £575,000 and £600,000 in pension terms when you reach your chosen kind of full retirement age. And look, we're going to have this discussion about what really matters here, the cold, hard numbers or the stress of having a mortgage hanging over you until later life. But for me, it's quite a stark difference. I don't know what you think, Chris.
Yeah, that's huge. I mean, those are compelling numbers. If you're looking at it purely on a pound, shillings and pence basis, there's no contest, right? Those numbers are, well, almost double, not quite, but almost double the amount. 750K versus 1.3 something million. Yeah, that's a huge difference and one that you can't ignore.
Yeah. So this is the thing I think people find so difficult. And obviously, when we model these scenarios out, they are completely subject to change based on your kind of, things like investment performance over the long term. The assumptions we built into the model also assume that contributions are flat over the whole horizon. They won't stay flat. If your pay increases, if Tanya's pay increases, they should go up. They could also go down. We never know. We don't know what could go on in the world, whether AI comes and takes everybody's jobs in 3 years' time, as some people say, then things might be rather different. And then there is another alternative here where you can kind of keep feeding your pension, but then also add a little bit of overpayment to your mortgage and having a blended scenario middle of the road. But these are the two stark differences here. I mean, look, personally speaking, and when it comes to my mortgage with Ellen, my wife, I think we're in a rather different place on it. Actually, from a pensions perspective, we're in a very different place because Ellen has an NHS pension, which is a totally different animal to what you and I have, which is a defined contribution workplace pension plus having a SIP. Mm-hmm. She didn't have any of that. So our calculations on pensions are very different. And actually, there's definitely potential for hers to be rather more valuable than mine, assuming they don't start taking away more of the pension as it exists today. Our mortgage term, actually, we're coming up for our first remortgage next year. So that means we've only got 20 years left. Now, I'm 37. I just had to remember there how old I am. Feel old, man.
That's a sign you're getting older.
Old. Yeah. I'm 37 and Ellen is 30. Please, God, don't let me get this wrong. 34.
Okay.
So next year, let's say I'm 38 and she's 35. We've only got 20 years left. She'll be 55 when our mortgage finishes, assuming we don't extend it at any point. And I'll be 58, which is, look, from my purposes, is great. So what we're highlighting here is that you are in a trickier position here, right? You've got a bigger and a harder mortgage, and this is a real source of stress. And I can imagine for me, it would be a real source of stress if I were in that position too, right?
So there's a few things I've been thinking about this. Look, it is a source of stress having a mortgage every month. Look, rates are higher than they have been in recent years. There's nothing to say that they won't go higher, but I think my optimistic self feels that we might be at the sort of higher end of those rates, and they might drift down a little bit in the next few years anyway, which would free up more income to maybe do more with, depending on what we decide to do. I've made peace with the fact that we've got this large long mortgage term and this large mortgage. One of the interesting things that I've seen, without getting too technical, that made me feel better about it was this idea that with a mortgage, with the nature of inflation, I'm basically shorting the currency in terms of the pound, because in real terms, in theory, that mortgage should get cheaper the more time over the life of it, because of the fact that inflation will rise and those numbers will seem smaller in 27 years' time, relatively speaking, than they are today. So that makes me sleep better at night, knowing that it should become easier. The other thing that I've been sort of bouncing around is look, what do you think market returns are going to be? Now, on a lot of the things we've done, the thing we did on the 100K pension tipping point pod, we looked at various scenarios. I think of around 5%, 7%, and then higher. 7% is a good kind of long run average for stock market returns. If you're looking at that and what you want to do with money over a 27-year time horizon, if my mortgage is 4.5%, I'm guaranteed to be making 4.5%, right? Because I'm paying that down off the debt. So that is the return when all is said and done off the back of those extra repayments. However, I'm leaving 2.5% on the table there in theory. And there's no guarantees, obviously, past performance, no indication of future performance and all the rest of it. But I'm quite comfy with that 7% long run average figure. So that's sort of another thing that's in my head. So I could start paying it off sooner, and looking at numbers based on that £500 a month additional, depending just on today's rates, that would pay it off a good 9-10 years early for us. So that brings it into early 60s rather than early 70s for me, which feels great. With that, when I'm older, will my employment be the same? Will I be earning the same? Will I want the freedom to be able to pick up work, put it down, not necessarily have to meet the regular demands of a of a mortgage every single month. That's something that, appeals. But then you look at the size of those pension pots and the difference is stark, right? In terms of income, what could potentially come as an income from there. In fact, it's probably worth thinking about that. On that option one you talked about with a combined pension pot of around £750,000 in 2053 money, that puts us household income at £40,500 a year, which is in today's money, right? Whereas if we stuck with the 1.3 million scenario, so putting that £500 into the pension, not overpaying the mortgage and letting the mortgage run normally, then we're closer to 52,400. So on the PLSA averages, they both kind of fall into the moderate. So you've got moderate, comfortable, and I can't remember what the other one before that is, but it's, people are going to find it a bit harder. If you add in state pension provision, which again, who knows if that's going to exist, then those are the numbers that we're kind of looking at. And I think there's a big difference in those numbers. 12 grand a year. That's significant, particularly with no mortgage when, if we're into our 70s. All of these numbers are kind of bouncing around. So it's a no-brainer. It's put the money into the pension if you're looking at the numbers. But then it's like, well, what do I want my lifestyle to look like in my 60s, Ed? That's the nagging doubt. How do I want to feel about it? Would it be better to have the flexibility of just not having to make those monthly repayments and instead having a far lower monthly bill? And does that give me a better quality of life? How long will I live into retirement? All these questions are bouncing around, and I'm not entirely sure. But,
So, yeah, this throws up a number of further interesting questions, and this is why this issue becomes quite complicated quite quickly. It's not as easy as just boiling it down to option one, option two. I think one of the potential benefits of going for that option two of maximizing the pensions, and there is a drawback to this, which I will come on to in terms of the tax problem. As things currently stand, obviously in 30 years' time, things might be rather different, but as they stand today, anyway, one of the things which you could potentially do is, and this is something that people tend to forget with mortgages, is actually a lot of the interest that you pay on your mortgage is kind of front loaded. So by the time you're coming towards the end of your mortgage term, you're actually paying down tons of principal, really. So it's much more a kind of easier perhaps to get that principal down later in the later years, because you've got over that front loaded interest part of the deal. So if you grow that bigger pot, and then let's say you've got, I don't know, 50 grand left on the mortgage when you're at that age 68 point, there is an option actually to take tax-free cash out your pension and just use that to finish off the mortgage, so you're not still paying it by when you're kind of at 72, that original end date. And that is potentially an effective way of doing it. Yes, it brings the size of your pot down a little bit, but when you're at that level, 50 grand is kind of marginal.
If you're talking about 1.3 million, is that what you're saying?
Yeah, but again, it does still mean that you're still ultimately living with that mortgage for much longer than you would really like to be. Now, I think the thing that also gets lost in this discussion sometimes is that obviously a home is something that you live in, and a pension is something that is a bit more abstract. It's a pot of money that goes into abstract investments, etc. But actually, there is an argument for treating your home as something of an asset as well, and actually comparing that against, obviously comparing the kind of long-term performance of that against something like the stock market, but also from a tax efficiency perspective. And this is where things get a little bit complicated, and I'd be super keen to hear people's thoughts on this, because I think this is something that gets forgotten, is that property obviously comes with drawbacks. You have to pay to look after it. You're reliant on housing market valuations and this kind of thing. It's a highly illiquid asset. You don't really know what it's worth until you try and sell it. You have lots of other tax considerations on that property, which may or may not be about to start changing. If you want to buy a new house, the stamp duty, blah, 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 all that kind of stuff. But actually, as efficient investment is actually, and this is especially when it comes to things like inheritance tax, it's actually really generous, because once you roll to, and if you're in a married couple or a civil partnership, your combined inheritance tax-free allowance is up to £1 million once you factor in the residence nil rate band and this kind of thing. This exists today. It might not exist like that in the future, but actually that becomes quite a powerful asset for passing on to your loved ones or whoever it may be. And this is completely the opposite of the case with the pensions now, where they're changing the tax rules around inheritance of pensions. It's being brought inside estates. The marginal rates on these estates are going to be really high because you're going to potentially be taxed at 40% over your allowance, inheritance tax. Then whoever inherits your pension will then have to pay income tax at their marginal rate to draw down that pot. And there are some scenarios where you're looking at 50%, 60%, even in the worst case scenario, a 90% tax on that pension pot for whoever inherits it. But what all this to say is actually, if you build up a larger pot and then you're also able to pay off that house, then you can actually just spend the pension, and that's what really needs to happen, and then pass on the house. So that's really complicating tax factors here. And obviously we don't give advice on this podcast. We're just thinking about our own situations. Anybody thinking about this specifically today should really consider speaking to a financial advisor who is regulated and can help you with this.
Particularly with the complexity of what you just outlined, Ed, I think. Yeah.
Absolutely. It's a super complex problem. Obviously, we spend a lot of time talking about it, but not everybody's going to be as comfortable with that. But this is just some of the things that people need to think about, and really flagging it up, because actually somebody in this situation should be considering getting financial advice in that situation because of the complexities, the potential for errors and issues. Does that tax thinking, how does that change your thinking on it?
Well, do you know what? I hadn't really considered it. That's too many variables for me to think about. I've almost thought, look, what does it look like when I hit 68? What is the ideal scenario? And then it's almost like phase 2 will begin then. Obviously, I'll start thinking about it before then, but then it's like, how do I make that pot last? How long do I think I'll live for? What is it that I want to leave my kids, et cetera, et cetera? And because it's a 27-year time horizon, things are going to change between now and then. We know that. We can only work with the information we've got today. It does change it slightly in that I think I need a two-pronged approach. You know, that pension pot of 1.3 something, that's something that I definitely want to head towards. So for the current amount, you know, the additional 500 quid, it seems like a no-brainer. We need to, as spoken about in the tipping point pod, I've started my pension transfer to a fixed fee SIP provider. You know, we've started to gather up Tanya's small pots so we can start to really put all that money in together and make it compound as hard as possible. So, you know, I think that is something that I'm dyed in the wool that I want to go for. What changes in the future is if my scenario about that interest rate on the mortgage is going to get lower, then I think that will just, we've proved we can manage at the moment when it comes to the mortgage rate and the repayments, monthly repayments. Any additional savings that are made there, once I've sorted out my life insurance and my protection cover, which I'm doing at the moment, that goes back into the mortgage. That just goes back into the mortgage, and we try and chip away at that sort of principle as much as we can. And then once there's further sort of childcare savings, then there's a discussion then about going back to our sort of 50, 30, 20 episode. We've probably been a bit miserly on ourselves these days in terms of what we can do in the present day. So there's a conversation about, you know, living life now and living life in the future, but certainly a portion of that can also go into paying off the mortgage. And that way we can do both. So we're still on track for that 1.3, all being well, touch wood. And then we can start to chip away at the principal. So I'm in a good position with that in terms of feeling positive about the future and where that could potentially go. As we know, anything can happen between now and then.
Yeah, I mean, I would. This is the thing that's the real kind of danger here is obviously getting that little windfall every month is a real win, getting that back, and it's so hard to not let that just suddenly start bleeding into the lifestyle creep or 1 month saying, no, you know, just this month I'll let myself have it so I can have, you know, go to the pub or whatever. And then before you realize it's just gone. So I think I would urge, and Chris, I know you are disciplined anyway, probably, and definitely more disciplined than me, but I would urge discipline for anybody in that position to kind of stay the course, use that money for something intelligent, pay your pension first, pay your ISA first, etc., or use it for that long-term good rather than instant gratification, which we are also told off for taking these days.
Yeah, I think the compounding thing, Ed, is a big thing. You know, since we've got to the tipping point, I'm like, look, there's time here. There's time here to make a real difference. So I want to supercharge every single one of the pounds that we have in that kind of those long-term savings vehicles. Yeah. So I feel like I'm missing out, or future me is missing out and will kill me if I don't do that.
Yeah. And I'm going to be like, I think to finish off on a slightly bearish note, perhaps, on, because you've mentioned interest rates there and some of the differentials, and I think my big concern at the moment is really that I think we have a problem with inflation in the UK that isn't going away. What that means in practice is that interest rates where they are not going away. We're not going back to where they were 5 or 6 years ago now. That has double implications in my mind, where the mortgage rate the interest on that remains kind of higher than is comfortable, which is in itself an incentive to try and overpay. But I also think on the flip side of that, when you look at the stock market and its ability to stay ahead of inflation is quite powerful. And really, the stock market, what you're effectively doing is taking a position against, like you said earlier, you're taking a position against the state of inflation. Effectively, you're saying, I think inflation is going to do this by owning something instead of just relying on cash. You are essentially taking a position that you want to outstrip inflation, and that's what it's all going to come down to, really, is staying ahead of that inflation trap.
Yeah, I think on a lot of these scenarios where I've modelled this 27-year, what this pension pot growth could look like and what kind of income that could translate into in retirement, there's an assumption of a 2.5% inflation drag over that long run period of time. It has occurred that could be higher, in which case I need a larger pot, right? As well as paying down that mortgage debt. And actually, maybe the inflation on the mortgage debt works in your favor, because in general terms, that becomes a smaller figure over the longer period. So I think that's probably a stronger argument to say, put the money into the pension pot, because you're going to need that, that inflation drive is probably going to happen.
Yeah.
You know, that's a far easier to get around it, you know.
I think that's something that also gets forgotten, is that when you take a mortgage out, it is effectively, assuming your interest rates aren't astronomical, the cost of that mortgage over time effectively deflates, because assuming your income goes up with inflation, then the relative cost of that mortgage should go down over time. Again, it's all completely reliant on interest rates. I think, just to finish off, Chris, has this brought you any closer to a decision, or are you still?
Yeah, I think it has. Look, I think it's going in the pension. And then, you know, we'll see what happens in the next 3 years or so in this wild and wonderful world that we live in. And if any more spare cash becomes available, then it's a case of balancing up between overpaying the mortgage and maybe giving present Chris and Tanya a bit of a break and allowing us to have a little bit more disposable income. But it's the first sign of that sort of huge childcare bill starting to chip down as well, which is, you know, a nice psychological win. And reallocating that capital we're lucky we're in this kind of long-term planning mode, because I think, you know, like I said, we've got time for that compounding to work and a clear plan, and we started to put it into action. So it's good to be able to do that and rocket charge that a bit more.
That's it. So everybody, let us know. We do try and read all comments and reply and keep the conversation going. Let us know whether you think Chris is on the right path here, whether he needs to do something else entirely, what your own situation is, whether you're trying to pay down your mortgage or contribute more to the pension. Super interested to hear from you all. So with that, I shall say thank you, Chris.
My pleasure, Ed, as always.
And thank you, everybody, for tuning in. We shall speak to you all again very soon. Thank you and goodbye.